together. The issue of bishops is an important issue. The Catholic Church is an Episcopal church. That means we have an organization that sees bishops as an important part of the structure. Of course, the Church of England is, in the United States, they call it the Episcopal Church. That's their name here in America. Lutherans are not an Episcopal church mainly because of Luther's disgust with the corruption and the bribery and the nepotism that was involved in appointing bishops. So you had to pretty much purchase your office to be a bishop. And so he does, Lutherans have this allergic reaction to the very word bishop. But they are, in a sense, very similar in structure. They have what they call a district president. And the district president functions like we see a bishop doing. And they make a little bit more use of what we call a synod of the church. So they have this structure of, and you see the word synod in the council documents, because that is an ancient word that is the same as kind of a gathering or a council of church leaders. So they use that word more frequently. And so you hear about the Missouri Synod or the Wisconsin Synod. That means there's a certain cluster of Lutheran churches under this one general way of thinking. People like the Amish and the other Mennonite churches, which also came out of the German Reformation, they are not Episcopal at all. The local pastor is the ultimate authority for a very small cluster of families. Might only be just one town, but that pastor is pretty much the ultimate authority. But they depend on the basic order. They use the word ordnung, and the order, which is pretty much the same. In other words, we separate ourselves from the mass of sinful humanity, and we are the church. And so the basic rules of whether or not you're going to use electricity or telephones and things, it's pretty much a general consensus. But some will let the farmers use mechanized machinery and some won't. Some will make a long-distance phone call if a relative gets sick, some will not. And that's based on the local pastor sets that. So the Calvinist churches are not Episcopal. They are typically what we would call Presbyterian. They believe in a cluster of leaders, and so they do not have a one leader that would be considered a district leader or a bishop. So the Catholic Church is Episcopal, and in the council, as the council was getting organized, the Second Vatican Council, the bishops were all thinking of the First Vatican Council. They couldn't help but be thinking about that. And that was not exactly a happy experience in the church's history. So there was a certain kind of apprehension about what's going to happen in this council, this Vatican Council. And they knew that there was some unfinished business in that one. So that was kind of lingering in the background. In fact, Pope John XXIII had to formally close the First Vatican Council before he could open the second, because they never had done that. The First Vatican Council was convened in 1870, I think, 69 or 70, just about 100 years before this council was going. And it was an extremely reactionary time. First of all, the Catholic Church in those days was basically the European Catholic Church. Even the United States was a missionary territory yet at that time. And in Europe, you had not only the tremendous splinter of the Protestant Reformation, but then there was something new happening. Up until that time, there were disputes among Christians about specific points of doctrine or specific beliefs or behaviors. But everybody believed in religion. Well, in the 1800s in Europe, people were saying religion is just a lot of superstition. You don't need religion. What you need is a careful scientific method, and that's all we really need. And so the whole movement that we don't need religion, we don't need God, we don't need all that folderol. All we need to do is be precise, and we can communicate knowledge through our mutual study of things. That's all we really need. So we have democracy, or whatever kind of government we have. Usually it's a more democratic kind of government that's emerging. We don't need monarchs either, as a matter of fact. And in the French Revolution, you know, there were bishops being led to the guillotine just like there were princes and kings. So they were literally moving ahead without religion at all. So the church was really under siege, and unfortunately the position they took was quite reactionary. Rather than trying to engage that conversation and think of some reasons why religion might be important, they dug in their heels, and it was a big battle. Well, anyway, so Pius IX calls the First Vatican Council to try to cope with these things. Now, what they did do, and we have since grown from this, they did come up with a formula that knowledge, human knowledge, is obtained in more than one way. It is obtained in scientific methods, but it's also obtained through faith. So faith is not superstition or just take it on faith, don't ask any questions, but rather faith is a real assent of the mind to what you know is real, but you know it's real from a different dimension than the scientific method. So there's really two different ways of coming to knowledge. And this particular insight continues to ferment right up until fairly recently. Pope John Paul wrote an encyclical maybe 10 or 15 years ago, Faith and Reason, right? And he talks about it as the two wings, faith and reason, the two wings that support the life of the person. So that discussion is that's a legitimate way of looking at things. Well, the next order of business was, all right, so if faith is a kind of knowledge, how do you know what is true about your faith? Well, you've got to have an official teacher. And so they came up with the notion that the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, as the primary bishop, that's the last word. So what the Pope says about matters of faith is infallible. And so they're going to make this statement. Well, there was a tremendous amount of discussion about that, and not a real consensus at all. I guess there was a majority, otherwise they would have gotten voted down, but how strong-armed that majority was formed is a matter of historical record. And meantime, there's a revolution going on in what we now call Italy. At this time, there were still separate states throughout the whole peninsula. So Sicily and Naples and the Papal States was the central part around Rome, and there were 7 or 8 different major states throughout the peninsula. And Garibaldi was the famous revolutionary who was moving toward uniting the whole Italian population into one nation. Well, that was literally going on. Garibaldi's troops were literally taking over areas of the Papal States while the bishops were meeting in the Vatican Council. So it was not exactly a peaceful, pleasant time. And in fact, this was getting hotter and hotter, and the debate in the council hall was getting hotter and hotter, and so some of the bishops simply up and left. You couldn't just book a flight out quickly. You had to arrange for a transatlantic, if you're going to come to America, you had to get on a ship, or if you're in some other country, get a train. They may have had trains at this point. 1870, were there trains? So some bishops simply left town, and the council simply stopped meeting. That last debate, or the last vote over the infallibility, was partially conducted by long-distance cable and letter to count the final tally, because they simply didn't have a majority of people there to take the vote. So that was a pretty unsettled time. But the fact that they had agreed, finally, that the Pope was infallible, that made many people think that you don't need any more councils. We have a better system now. We have a more modern system. You simply have to ask the Pope, and then you know what is right and what is wrong. And that feeling continues to ripple through our current life. So that is all in the background of this council. Many of the bishops realized that there should have been a different kind of discussion about the role of bishops. The role of official leadership in the church should have come up from a different point of view. And so they felt that what happened when you make the Pope infallible, what you have then is all the other bishops of the world are simply like district managers. And it's like the Pope is the CEO, and then everybody else is just sort of an appointee of the Pope, and it's all just one big diocese over the whole world, the whole Western world. So they felt that we needed to address that. So in the document on the church, chapter 3 is focused on that notion of, all right, what are bishops, and how is the hierarchy organized? So what they did was they went back to the beginning. There was this basic principle of go back to the beginning, back to the sources. And when you read, especially in Paul's epistles, and in the very earliest fragments of letters that we have from a few of those very early churches in the first century and a half or 2 centuries, what it boils down to is there seem to be 3 principal ministries of leadership. Presbyters are mentioned frequently, deacons are mentioned regularly, and overseers are mentioned often. So the word overseer in Greek is episkopos, is where we get the Latin word for bishop and then English bishop. So that there's an overseer. Presbyter, the common English word would be an elder. That means a person who is part of a little council, a group of people who would advise and help the overseer do what needs to be done, give advice and assistance to the overseer. And the deacons are the ones who carry out the actual day-to-day work of the church. And there are evidence in the very earliest letters about the deacons in Rome, for example. It was like a huge social service agency. It would compare to Michigan's social service agency, what they were doing in Rome. A tremendous amount of work that the church was doing for widows and orphans and the poor in one way or the other. That's why a lot of those early martyrs are deacons. Lawrence and Sebastian, a lot of those guys were deacons. Well, they were the key people, running places like St. Christine's, that kind of thing. So those three seem to have been kind of the three key people, three key groups of leaders. And so they kind of focus on that, and they actually change the understanding of ordination from what we had since the Middle Ages, of all these steps going toward ordination as being minor orders and whatnot. They kind of took the emphasis off of that and focused more on these three basic orders, which ends up being bishop and presbyter and deacon. Now, deacon is still simply a step to priesthood at this time, but they have one paragraph where they say if a national conference of bishops decides to, they can reestablish the permanent diaconate. They thought it would be used mainly in missionary territories. They didn't imagine that other dioceses would use it because at that 1960s, they were just, lots of priests, seminaries were full, so they didn't really imagine they would need to have deacons in the United States or places like that. But surprisingly, almost all the bishops decided quite quickly to establish deacons, but they did not imagine that would happen. But you could. They allowed for the possibility. So what chapter 3 is about that is to kind of conceive of, all right, who are these overseers? What is the role of the bishop? Does the bishop have some kind of independent authority, presence, ministry in his own right, in his own diocese? And so that's basically what they come up with. Now, of course, they have to give very profound vows to the supreme order of the Bishop of Rome. So in the outline that I sent out, I quote from number 18 in What is Familiar. Following the First Vatican Council, this synod declares the doctrine of the institution, the perpetuity, the force, and the nature of the sacred primacy of the Roman pontiff and his infallible magisterium. Continuing this same undertaking, we declare the teaching concerning the bishops, successors of the apostles, who, along with the successors of Peter, the vicar of Christ, the visible head of the whole church, govern the house of the living God. So they make sure you understand we are not getting rid of the infallible Pope. Now, there were of course, there were some bishops, especially those who work in the Vatican, who were afraid that might happen. So they kept speaking for this to make sure you know that the bishops can't consider themselves independent operators. And so they come up with the word the college, the collegiality. So in several of these chapters in Lumen Gentium, 19, 21, 22, 23, notice how often the word college, collegial unity, as a college or permanent group over which he placed Peter, chosen from among them. The Synod teaches that the fullness of the sacrament of order is conferred by episcopal consecration. That's something that we had never imagined before. We thought the fullness of ordination was the priesthood. And to be able to say Mass, that was pretty much the apex of Christian sacramental ministry. And the bishops was strictly an administrative role. important for the maintaining unity of the church, but strictly an administrative role. Here they're saying, number 21, the fullness of sacramental order is conferred by episcopal consecration. So this is undoubtedly called the supreme priesthood. In other words, they use the word priesthood there, the highest point of the ministry. The sacred character is so imprinted that bishops, in an eminent and visible way, take on the functions of Christ, the teacher, the shepherd, and pontiff or priest, and they act in his person. So this is a clarification that is new, that the bishop, that is a unique order, and all other orders are focused in that direction. So those of us who were ordained in the era, so we were ordained right about this time, still in the old pontifical, this is kind of a put down for us, for priests, because we were kind of all thinking as we're getting ready to lie on the floor there and get ordained, that we would be at the apex of being priests, but now suddenly the bishops are the head, and so we are somehow part of that. So we've been wrestling with that since. The person of each bishop, in number 22, the person of each bishop makes the living Christ present in the local community. The bishops exercise their ministry in their own right. All the bishops throughout the world live in communion with one another and with the Bishop of Rome in a bond of unity, charity, and peace. They exercise their ministry in collegiality, and when acting as one communion, they participate in the infallible teaching ministry of the church. So this is a new understanding. This is a new way of looking at things, that there really is this sacramental union that the bishops embody. So this is new, and this is not bad. This is a way of realizing that the church really is worldwide, but it also really exists in each area under each bishop. So they're giving credit to the specific local church as really the church present, active here in this district, in this area.
Is that where they get this magisterium business of the we're talking about the ministry becomes infallible?
They're using the word magisterium has been used right along. That's not a new word. There were two kinds of magisterium. In the Middle Ages, the magisterium, it comes from the universities, and so there was the magisterium of the teaching, and then magisterium of the legal procedures. And so you had kind of like two different, so the professors, the theologians in the universities were engaged mainly in the magisterium of teaching, and the bishops were in charge of the organization and the running of things. So they each had authority, but one was in administration, one was in teaching. And it was assumed that the universities and the teachers would be the ones who would lead the way in terms of how the doctrine is formulated. And the bishops would organize how the faith is lived. So that was the way it was in the Middle Ages. What they're doing here is bring them together. So the bishop kind of centralizes and is teaching magisterium in the role of the bishop. And so that has been a tussle since then, because many of these bishops really aren't, or weren't at least, they're becoming more so now. But at that time, many of these bishops were not really theological authorities in their own right. Some of them were, Dearden was, but some of them were not. And they're on a learning curve here of being real teachers. But that's where you're using it. Number 25 gives us, this is new, religious assent of the will and intellect is to be given in a special way to the authentic teaching authority of the Roman pontiff, even when he is not speaking as ex cathedra. Now, the ex cathedra word is from the First Vatican Council, when the Pope decides to formally proclaim a truth ex cathedra from his chair. Cathedra is the chair. So the official teaching role of the Pope, sitting in his magisterial chair, professorial chair, when he speaks ex cathedra, that's infallible teaching. What they're saying here is that religious assent of the will and intellect is to be given not only when he's speaking ex cathedra, that is, the supreme teaching authority respectfully acknowledged and sincere adherence given to decisions he's delivered in accordance with his manifested will, which is communicated chiefly by the nature of the documents, by the frequent repetition of the same doctrine, or by the style of verbal expression. So, they're saying here that you have to give religious assent of the will and intellect to the authentic teaching authority, even if it isn't ex cathedra. So that has been reminded to us over the years. We've heard that. Now, in the top of page 2 in the minutes, at the very end of chapter 25, or paragraphs, this infallibility, however, with which the divine Redeemer willed his church to be endowed in defining doctrine concerning faith or morals, extends just as far as the deposit of divine revelation that is to be guarded as sacred and faithfully expounded. Oh, so there is a limit on this. It's only about matters where there's divine revelation. How do you know whether it's divine revelation? That's the question. Huh? So the theologians had been already examining the First Vatican Council and realizing that the Pope can't just speak infallibly about anything. The Pope only speaks infallibly about things that are actually revealed in Scripture, it really is divine revelation. And then the teaching authority can assume this infallible assurance that this is really true. And so that's the clause here that's very important, that even if it isn't infallible, you're supposed to give assent to the will and intellect, but about matters of revelation. So what is truly revealed? So they're willing to admit, for example, that the fact that priests should not get married is not really a matter of revelation. Because they know that in the early church, clergy did get married. And they have to, they really can't say that women can't be ordained by revelation. They're just not able to, they'd like to be able to, but they can't. but it's so much part of our history that you can't change it. And so there's a case where the Pope can expect religious assent of the will and intellect about the fact that women can't be ordained, for example. And that's exactly what they do. They say, you've got to give assent to it, even though it's not, you can't prove that it's part of revelation. So the dispute then will be whether or not this particular issue is a matter of divine revelation. And then you have to then find out what that means. Now then there's a further distinction you can make, that granted, even if it is about divine revelation, you have to look at what is the underlying meaning of that revelation. The particular formula that has been chosen, that may not necessarily be infallible. It's the meaning that's infallible. So when the Pope speaks infallibly, he's speaking of what he's trying to communicate. What is the meaning? What was God trying to say in this particular issue about which we are saying this? But the formula, the way we're putting it, the wording, may in fact undergo some transformation as time goes on. Now, everybody wouldn't agree to that, but most theologians hold to that. That the formulation itself may develop. The meaning can't develop, can't change, but the formulation of it can develop because the way we say things, the way we express things, continues to change and develop over the course of time and through experience. So not only, certainly, first of all, it's only matters of revelation. Secondly, you have to look at the meaning and see that if you're communicating the same meaning, then you're able to do that. You're able to make a modification in the formulation of it. So that kind of ferment's been going on ever since the First Vatican Council. So this is all in Lumen Gentium. This is the document on the nature of the church. Of how bishops govern. Notice in 27, bishops should realize that they are sent to be not to be served, but to serve. They're subject to weakness themselves. The bishop can sympathize with those who are ignorant and go astray. Let them not refuse to listen to his subjects. Now, they use the word subject as if it was a monarchy with subjects. Let him not refuse to listen to his subjects, whom he looks after as truly sons and daughters, whom he exhorts cheerfully to cooperate with him. The cheerfully modifies the subjects, by the way. It doesn't modify the bishop. I looked that up in the Latin. We're supposed to be cheerful here. The sons and daughters are cheerful as they cooperate with the bishop. The faithful must adhere to the bishop as the church does to Christ, as Christ does to the Father, so that in all things may agree together to the unity and abound to the glory of God. Well, that's great spirituality. And that's, of course, St. John's Gospel at the Last Supper, that they all may be one. And, that's beautiful stuff. And we really do want to have that sense of the Father and I are one, that they may all be one, as you and I, Father, and that. So that's what they're referring to here, that the church really is this communion of love that makes the reality of God present in this time and place. So we really can't dispute that. We don't want to go against that. We are supposed to be a communion of love. And that pretty much defines what the church is. It's a communion of faith, hope, and love. So that's basically what they're saying here. They use the words like sons and daughters and subjects and stuff like that, which is kind of paternalistic. And so there's a case where the reality, especially as you just read it in chapter 14 and 15 of John's Gospel, really is quite noble. The formulation leaves something to be desired. And probably, as time goes on, we may not be using some of this paternalistic language. 28.1, again the word presbyters. What you're going to find in these documents, they're not always consistent. They go back to the beginnings and they use the word presbyter instead of priest. But because we've been using the word priest so much for 1,000 years, they keep slipping into using priest when they probably should say presbyter. I've tried to use it the way it is in the Latin. So sometimes you'll see presbyter when they say presbytery, but it also means priest. Now the presbyters are the group of counselors around the bishop. And so that is where 28 is about there. It's about the presbyters acting as counselors to the overseer. And then he is able to delegate to them certain things. So in the earliest days, the presider at the liturgy was one person, and the presbyters stood around. And then as the city of Rome got so large that you couldn't all get to one place at one time, it was the presbyters who were standing around the altar who then got delegated to go out and celebrate Eucharist in the suburban areas simultaneously with the overseer, so that they all were celebrating Eucharist together, literally at the same hour of the day on Sunday morning. Tim, you were looking up this altar boy named Narcissus, is that his name, or Tarcissus? Tarcissus, who was an acolyte, who was one of the people who carried a bit of the consecrated bread from the bishop's altar and carried it out to one of these presbyters' liturgies going on simultaneously, and then that would be joined into the cup at that altar, so that there was literally a union of the body of Christ in all the different churches. And of course, Tarcissus, this was very precious, and a bunch of thugs waylay him on his way, and they say, "Give us what you got," just like they do today. "Give us your shoes," you know. And so they think he's got something very precious. Well, of course he's got something very precious. It's the body of Christ. So he's not about to give it up. And he gets beat up over this, and in fact killed. And of course, these thugs are pretty disappointed when they finally open up his clenched fist and find all the little scrap of bread in there, and they're very disappointed. They didn't get anything from their violence. But anyhow, he's a saint, right? Patron saint of altar boys. That was really good. So, but that's what's going on there. It's that union of the Eucharist happening throughout the whole district. And it's the presbyters who are then assigned as these delegates in different areas. In the earliest church, only the bishop could forgive sins. And the presbyters then were delegated to do that later on. In the Middle Ages, when the monks, especially Irish monks, came to Europe preaching renewals, they were just routinely hearing confessions all the time. And so they simply went ahead and did it. And people felt forgiven, even though they weren't even ordained priests. Eventually the bishops gave in and said, "All right, I'll delegate all the priests to hear confessions." But that's a separate delegation, by the way. Father Solanus, for example, did not have the delegation to hear confessions. You know, people are surprised to hear that. He was considered to be not bright enough in theology school to be able to preach or hear confessions. So he could say Mass because he was ordained a priest, but he was not delegated to hear confessions because he couldn't be trusted to give good advice. Because people streamed over to St. Bonaventure, you know, every day because he was a doorkeeper, you know, and so all kind of people poured out their hearts and souls to Solanus because he was a real sympathetic pastoral person, but he had never been delegated to hear confession. So that's a special delegation that the bishop gives, and when the priest is ordained, you give that specific authorization. Now that you're ordained, I now authorize you to preach, to hear confessions. So to share in that ministry of teaching and forgiving sins. Incidentally, at this point, deacons are not authorized to hear confessions or to anoint the sick. But theoretically, there's no reason why that cannot come about. And I'm not necessarily saying it's going to. I'm just saying that it's easily could be done, that as time goes on, as deacons begin to do these ministries of visiting the sick and carrying communion and all that kind of thing, that could be delegated to them as well, because they're part of the orders deacons, that's the last paragraph here on the bottom of page 2, deacons are part of the ordered ministry, and so they could be delegated to do these things as well. They're already delegated to preach, so they probably could be delegated to hear confessions as well. So that's, I mean, not only probably, it could be, that's within the bishop's right to do that. But they will have to agree as a group that this is an important thing to do. Okay. Now, you were at a talk just, Sister, yesterday? What was that about?
Some of you were there, weren't you? Okay, you can correct anything I say. Gary Macy is a professor in California, and his basic interest is the history of liturgical activity. I had a book in graduate school from him on Eucharist, so that's what he did in that book. And he's also done a whole lot of work around the role of women in ministry in the history of the church. So yesterday he kind of spewed out a whole lot of facts, names, dates, the ministry that women were doing that was part of what we now look at as reserved to male clergy. But the early church, well, I shouldn't even say early, because everything kind of stopped after the Council of Florence in the 13th century. Pope Innocent III had a weekend council, which he had set the agenda for ahead of time, pushed through over the weekend, and the next year he died. But that council stopped the official ministry of women, and his point was that the concept of order had changed. In the 1200 years before that, order simply meant, and I think I had this right, the system that a community would use to organize its ministries of various kinds. And women were part of that because they had the gifts to do X, Y, or Z. And order got more hooked to the power to confect the Eucharist at that council that was kind of made the definition of what constitutes this. And it seems like from the complaints that were coming from bishops in those couple centuries before that, women were doing ministry and the bishops didn't like it, and they kept, putting out rules. And he made the point that the fact that rules had to be put out meant that it was going on. So anyway, it kind of stopped with Innocent III, and the ladies stayed home like they were supposed to.
Yeah. So in other words, this has been a long time in developing, and mainly the first millennium and into the second one, there's a real development and a change after the end of the year 1000, and so there's a lot of things that we take for granted is really from the second millennium. Interestingly, Ratzinger has said, I don't know, I can't find the place where he said it, but he claims that we really should go back to the first millennium and see what was the model of church at that time. And so that's still percolating. It's going to take a while.
One more thing from yesterday that I thought was quite interesting was that it wasn't until 1898 that the Pope appointed the bishops.
Yes.
That prior to that time, it was done by the presbyters, the priests, in consultation with the people. And it was only at that point that the Pope began to just do it without that. Now, there still is consultation, but it's
Yeah,
doesn't have the same authority.
that's a very recent thing. Although there also was a problematic problem of governors and princes could also appoint bishops. And so there was lots of confusion over that. So in the Second Vatican Council, they make it clear that from now on, there will no longer be any of these concordats with various governments allowing the local government to elect bishops, that this will be a prerogative of the church alone. But then the Pope then takes it over. I was teaching a class at Orchard Lake, and there was a Chaldean priest in the class, and one of the auxiliary bishops had just been appointed, and so we were talking about this in the break, and I just referenced that the Pope, they have to read this letter. He had heard about this letter from the Pope and wanted to know what that was as well. The Pope has to appoint him, and they have to read that appointment letter at the ordination. And he looks at me and he says, "The Pope appoints every bishop in the Latin Rite?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "How does he know all those people?" Which is, of course, the truth. He doesn't know them all. But you see, in the Chaldean church, and all the Eastern rites, the local church elects their own bishops. So that would be in terms of the metropolitan would be part of that. So, for example, in Michigan, the whole state of Michigan is one metropolitan area. There are 7 dioceses, Detroit being the principal one. And so in that model, the state of Michigan, the bishops of the various dioceses would choose the next bishop for Kalamazoo or Chicago, not Chicago, but Grand Rapids or whatnot. So that still is done in the Eastern rites, and that could be done again. Now, incidentally, let's move on to the document on bishops, the pastoral office of bishops. Notice they're using the word pastoral, and there's a reason for that. Some theologians were making the distinction between doctrinal teaching, and pastoral teaching. Other theologians, Bernard Lonergan would be one of them, Congar would also agree with this, that you really shouldn't make the distinction because every bit of theology better be pastoral, and if it's not pastoral, it's not worth your time. The whole point is that it's meant to take care of the people. That's pastoral. That it has this sense of relationship with your mission to care for the people. And that's all theology should be pastoral. And I would agree with that. But the reason why they say the pastoral office of bishops is that they have already set out some of the administrative facts in Lumen Gentium, chapter 3. Now they're going to write a more pastoral side of what it means to be a bishop and how these bishops should relate to one another. So that's what this particular document is about. And so as it gets underway, notice very quickly they talk about this collegial relationship. And in paragraph 5, representative bishops from different parts of the world will give more effective and helpful service to the Supreme Pontiff by meeting in a council called the Synod of Bishops. Now, that has never been done. They have done something like it, but they aren't doing what it calls for here. And that's the article that I had attached from Archbishop Quinn. Archbishop Quinn was the Archbishop of San Francisco. He's retired for some years now, but he's still active. He's getting up in years, but he's still active, as you can see. He wrote this article in the interim, between the time when Benedict resigned and before the conclave assembled. So I'm not sure where he was talking. And so he didn't know who was going to be the next pope. But the fact that the current pope had just resigned instigated him to bring out this point. And what he's talking about there is that what we need to do, or what we ought to do, even what they considered here in the Vatican Council, was to distinguish between the patriarchal function versus the administrative function. And so in other words, there's a certain sense that the Bishop of Rome has a sense of solidarity of the faith, that the faith of the Catholic Church is overseen and tended to in a unique charism of the Bishop of Rome. And that the other bishops of the world, and that's what paragraph 5 is calling for, the bishops of the world, representatives from each country, should meet with the Bishop of Rome in a council called the Synod of Bishops. Now, meaning that they would actually decide together, just like in the ancient church, the presbyters would advise the overseer. That's what they're calling for here. What has been happening instead of that, ever since Paul VI, they have what they call a Synod of Bishops. But the same thing, the Council of Florence happened, the same thing happens where the Pope sets the agenda and they don't make any decisions. They simply speak, and then the Pope takes it all under advisement, and a year or so later he writes an encyclical or some kind of statement saying, here's what we have talked about, and I'm telling you what we're doing. We seem to really know his priests. Priests, because of advancing age or sickness, should be requested to resign when necessary. So there's also the notion that if you get to the point you have to have health problems or age, you should resign. And then the bishop cares for the appropriate maintenance of those who retire. This is a bit of a friction over this. Priests have been agitating for years to get some kind of a formal retirement benefit. Dearden resisted that. And so even though technically we had an agreement that we would retire at a certain age, but he would take care of us. The bishop would take care of us. So for years, they didn't fund this retirement. We had it in theory, but there was no money going into it. As a result, it's completely underfunded as of now. Now, recently, within the last 10 years, they have finally established a retirement fund for priests, but it's extremely expensive for the parishes to fund it because it's been so many years that they just weren't funding it. So that was a dispute because theoretically the bishop cares for the welfare of the priests, and there wasn't any need for a retirement fund. So that's a technicality, but it's been Father Bill Scherzer was the patron saint of working for retirement benefits for priests. Priests can or do not have to. You have to make a statement to the IRS. If you consider yourself the same as a religious order priest, even a diocesan priest can state that he does not believe in that, and that he only accepts compensation just to keep him alive. He doesn't have to pay into Social Security, and of course you would not get a benefit from it. You can exempt yourself from it. Most priests, though, are in it because now we do get a living stipend. We don't get a professional salary, but we get a stipend that, and of course we get a huge amount of side benefits. There's a place to live, for example. All the costs of food and housing are taken care of by the parish. So when you add up the compensation, it's comparable to a professional salary. That's why the argument about whether or not you could have married priests or not, well, it would cost too much money. Well, that's a straw argument because the amount of support that a priest gets just to live in the rectory and that kind of thing. The parish pays for the car insurance and various things. So, but we report that to the IRS as income, and now I'm over 65, or 66 and a half, whatever it was when I turned that proper age. I began to get Social Security payments then. So, but you have to, they assume you're in it unless you declare that you're out. Once you declare you want to be out, then you don't go back in again. You're now good. Some religious orders have joined it. So, for example, your community joined it at a certain point. You had to pay a lot of money into it to get established into it, but now you get some kind of social security benefit.
This outside when Shiloh came to the United States, we got an explicit track, so, what do you mean, I came to Detroit to get paid less?
Sucker said, I came to Detroit to get paid less. Yeah. Yep. Priest number 35, priests and religious vows are also cooperators in the Episcopal order, said to belong to the clergy of the diocese, while remaining faithful to the observance of their own rule and relations of their own superiors. Number 37, we're almost done. Episcopal conferences should unite bishops of each nation. All ordinaries and coadjutors have deliberative vote, not titular bishops of their delegates. Decisions of an Episcopal conference have binding force if the matter is prescribed by common law or is convened by a mandate from the Apostolic See with at least 2/3 assent, and the decision is approved by Apostolic See. Last year I heard a talk by Father Sullivan, who wrote this book, Apostles to Bishops. Let me say two things about Father Sullivan's book and his work, and then we'll be finished today. Sullivan pointed out that had the American bishops during the sexual abuse crisis, had they convened a proper council of the entire Church of the United States, that would include the laity, instead of just going on their own to Dallas to make their policy, which wasn't really binding on themselves, had they really involved the whole American Church in this, including professionals, psychologists and psychiatrists and legal experts, as well as the lay faithful, and really done a proper regional council, they would have been more effective in terms of communicating to the church at large that we are handling this problem. But precisely because they did it almost in private, granted they let people in for the first day and let a few people speak, but then they closed the doors and they went ahead and did their own thing. It's precisely because they kind of just did it in their own privacy, they've never gained the confidence of the faithful. Now, Sullivan is in his 80s. He taught me about the church when I was in first year of theology. He's the guy that dropped the book, the new book on church that he had just written, and dropped it off the podium. Gentlemen, you were the first ones to use my new textbook, and you'll be the last. And he let it fall to the floor. And then next year, he's writing mimeograph sheets again, because the Vatican Council was underway. Anyway, he writes a book called From Apostles to Bishops. And you notice that in this conversation, there's references that the bishops, the college of bishops, are direct descendants of the college of the apostles. Notice that in the New Testament, the apostles, except for Judas, but after the other apostles die, the apostles are not replaced. The 12 maintain that iconic memory in the church, and many churches, like the Chaldeans, for example, look on St. Thomas as their founder. Many original churches can think of one of the apostles, one of the 12, as being their founding apostle. But that particular charism died when they died, and there's a new thing going on. That's overseer, presbyter, and deacon. Eventually it comes down to that. They didn't decide to replace each apostle as they died. For whatever reason, it didn't seem to. Paul talks about himself as an apostle born out of time. So he is added to the apostles because of his unique encounter with Christ. But beyond that, you don't have apostles as an office. You have overseers or bishops. Well, what Sullivan does is examine all the early writings that we have. We don't have a lot, but we do have some letters and teachings and whatnot. The Didache goes back here, the letters of St. Irenaeus, and the various ones. And so he talks about how the early churches were organized. And his contention is that for the most part, Syria would be an exception. It looks like in Syria, that would be Antioch, they rather quickly appointed a single overseer who was the bishop of the district. But in places like Rome specifically, it was really the group of presbyters that were running the church. And there was if you can go to St. Paul's outside the walls and look at these photographs, up on the wall of St. Peter and then Clement and Sixtus and, all the first popes of Rome, right, all around till the present day. Well, those people, they would have been what we would call the chairperson of the presbytery. They really weren't looked upon as being some very special person like we've got in the news today. That the presbytery ran the church, and the letters that come from Rome are coming from the presbyters. They actually sign it. Sometimes the chairperson signs it in the name of the presbyters. So that the earliest church seems to have been more of a Presbyterian model of a group of counselors. The overseer is the chairperson, and the overseer is the one who kind of makes sure that the deacons are carrying out the work. Frequently, when a pope died, when the bishop or overseer died, the presbytery then would elect the new overseer. They would often choose the main deacon, because he's the one who knew most of what was going on. And so frequently, the new bishop of Rome would have been the archdeacon of the city of Rome. And then he becomes the chair of the presbytery. And that goes on that way. So his point is that you really can't say that every one of us ordained priests can trace our ordination directly right back to an apostle. All of us kind of thought that as we were in the process. But it's not as simple as that. But so anyway, this is a nice study and very thoughtful, and it just helps us realize that the model of leadership has been developing and morphing for centuries, and it'll continue to do that. So we're only beginning the third millennium, so we've got plenty of time, and we'll continue to develop the leadership in our church. Nevertheless, this pastoral office of bishops is a fairly nice statement about the kind of concern and care that all of us should be having for one another. Yes. Question, microphone.
So what I'm wondering if this is how, if I'm correct in thinking this, if you think of this from a structural point of view, the bishops gave themselves more power, with the idea that maybe it would weaken the bureaucracy of the Vatican a little bit. But then, in that same process, they actually created a bigger bureaucracy. I mean, is that how it's looked at? You know what I mean? Because you mentioned that the bishops gave themselves more power. I mean,
decided to do. So the so-called Synod of Bishops that we have now, that meets maybe every 5 or 6 years, not systematically, just whenever the Pope calls for it on a given topic. But it's only advisory. It isn't decisive. So, but they're calling for a real synod of bishops, a real council that would meet on a regular basis as the church being linked together. So Quinn is saying that it's already there in the council. We simply have to do what the bishops called for 50 years ago. Notice that in paragraph 9 and 10, there are some references to the curial offices. That's the Vatican bureaucracy. That needs to be updated, and that notion of more helpful to bishops in our day, what they're saying is it's antiquated. It's simply not working. It has to be modernized, has to be reorganized to be more helpful to bishops in our day. Especially the number of these offices, presuming there are too many of them. Their titles, presuming that they are too lofty. Their procedures, presuming that they are too secretive. The extent of their authority, presuming that it's too far. And then promoting increased collaboration. So, again, paragraph 9 has not been implemented yet either. So the calling for that, they were really, in fact, many of these bishops chafing under the authoritarian attitudes of these bureaucrats in the Vatican. And then, none of the popes since have been able to do that yet. Whether or not Francis will do this, we'll see. But Paul couldn't do it. John Paul did not do it, nor did Benedict. Number 10, they have tried to do some more of that. There should be more international representation. Papal legates should be more international. Now, papal legates, those are there's a kind of a personal emissary from the Pope to various nations. They all used to be just Italian, right from Rome. Now they're more international. More local bishops should give input into these offices, and they should hear more from the laity. That does not happen too much yet. So this is all in the first introduction, the first chapter of this document. Chapter 2, the bishop and the particular church. So we've always known about the diocese as a local administrative area, but it's been looked upon simply as, in the Roman system, of delegating responsibility in certain territories to make it easier for the emperor, or whoever it is, or the governor, or the general of the army to carry on with business. But rather than, we call this a particular church. So the local diocese is the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church truly present and at work in each particular church. So the Church of Detroit is really the church in action, the church in our experience. So there's one of these canons that I use it once in a while, a canon for special occasions, has an optional prayer for the local church. So that's kind of neat, the Church of Detroit. You can say that there. Every diocese can say that, they can use that particular prayer. So the local church has a sense of integrity. Now, the advantage of that, this is true both in places like our own that are contemporary and modern, but also missionary territories. Each local church then has its own integrity. Therefore, it also has its own complexion. It has its own customs. It has its own way of doing things. So there can be a little more flexibility and tuning things to what is useful in your own particular area. Notice the word in paragraph 12, the second little paragraph. Let them, that's the bishops, expound the inestimable value of the human person. Now that's very important. That's something that's emerging in the whole 20th century and up until now is the significance, the integrity, the dignity of the human person. In fact, Pope John Paul II, before he was Pope, wrote a doctoral dissertation in philosophy called The Acting Person. Now, it's in the Detroit Public Library. I've read it. And if you're going to read it, you can do what you can in the first 4 chapters. But get to the 5th chapter, the final chapter, where he talks about the integrity of each individual person. Now, he's speaking from his experience in Poland under a communist regime. And so there, he said, no, this, each individual person has integrity. So it's a nice statement, that final chapter of his dissertation. So this is just kind of a movement that's underway all over the place, that the integrity of the human person. So that way we can organize churches around these persons, these all children of God with intelligence and freedom, who are able to represent and do the church each in their own district. Notice that bishops should be conscious of family life, children, social structures, professions, labor and leisure, arts and technology, poverty and affluence, ownership and just distribution of material wealth, war and peace, effective fellowship of all peoples, taking a particular 14.1, particular care for the poor and the underprivileged. Church should be on the speaking terms with the human society in which it lives, seeking dialogue, presenting teachings in clear language, unaggressively and diplomatically, with due prudence, combined with confidence, encouraging friendship. We don't always see that. This little interview, or it's a report from the streets of Buenos Aires that John Allen did. So I attached this also to the thing. The title is Pope Francis Gets His Oxygen from the Slums. And Allen is a reporter from the National Catholic Reporter, and he's based in Rome. And so he went to Buenos Aires right after Francis was elected Pope, and he interviewed people in the streets. And he went to this one slum called Slum 21. He points out that there's these slums that are so impersonal that they just name the slums by number. Slum 21. In other words, they're doing the opposite of what says here about the inestimable value of the human person. They're still treated as nobodies who just happen to be living there in poverty. But apparently Pope Francis has read this document. He apparently had prayed over this when he became bishop, and was in fact visibly present in this particular very poor district, and consciously chose a priest, a young priest, to be the assistant pastor there, even though this young priest was surprised at that and not sure he was able to do it. And after the third or fourth excuse that he was making, finally, okay, he said, let's pretend I've had 20 days to pray about this, and I'll say yes. Fine, he said, that's what you need to do. So he's still there, this young priest, and he's being interviewed along with some of the people that are there. How many people can go into their little hovels and get a photograph of the bishop next to one of their kids getting confirmed? So obviously, Pope Francis was trying to be that kind of a bishop, really being with the poor. So this is the model that's being set out here in this pastoral document on the bishop. We still have to work on this presenting teachings unaggressively and diplomatically. Bishops should get to use social media. They had no idea about Facebook in those days. Use principles of good psychology and pedagogy. In other words, the way it's communicated, the message is the medium. The medium is the message. What is that? Lewin. The medium is the message. He was writing at this time. I don't know whether they had that in mind or not. the reference to the Eucharist, forming one closely knit body united in the love of Christ. Bishops, number 16, bishops should be in the midst of their flock as one who serves, good shepherds, true fathers in one family, that all may live and work together in a union of charity. 16.5, bishops must be better prepared to look after the welfare of all the faithful, no matter their age, condition, or nationality. So our parish has just established a welcoming statement, and we have elaborated on that. Respect the place proper to the faithful in the affairs of the church, acknowledging their duty and right to work actively for the building up of the mystical body of Christ. In other words, there's a reference here that the people themselves, this is from, of course, the people of God in Luke Gentian, that all the faithful are involved in the work of the church. And the bishops need to tap into that. Bishops, at the very bottom of page 3, bishops work with public authorities to promote social and civil progress and prosperity. In other words, they're not envisioning the kind of antagonism that we've been seeing in the last few years between the Catholic bishops and the politicians in our country. I don't think that's what they had in mind. I think that they're trying to, promoting that there should be some dialogue going on, even if you don't agree. Now that will be very clear in the Church in the Modern World, which we've already looked at, that we know that people don't all agree on everything. So what we need to do is sit down and listen to one another and converse with each other, explain things to each other, come to some ability to get along together. The whole notion of forming some kind of a collaborative work together, even if you don't agree with every blessed detail of a person's theories, if you're focused on a certain cause, you can work together for that cause. So that's the kind of thing they're calling for here. Because they realize that bishops are an important focused person in a given area. As the leader of all the Catholics in that area, they have a part to play in the social arena. Number 20, civil authorities no longer have any right to interfere with the appointment of bishops. They're finally putting that to bed. It's still in many countries in Europe, Spain, Germany, not France anymore because of the revolution, but some of those countries, the civil authorities actually had pretty much the final say in who would be the next bishop of a given city. So that's put to rest. There's no more of that. Bishops should retire or resign from office when their age or advancing sickness makes it difficult to carry out this difficult work. So that's what Benedict did. And that's precisely the way he put it. He used pretty much these words, that he felt that in his age and his health was diminishing, and he was no longer able to carry out the work that he should be doing. So that's true of all bishops. So, and now there is a retirement age. I don't think they specify an age here, but now the policy is the age of 75. Bishops and priests submit their resignation, and then it's either accepted or it's not, but they have to submit the resignation. Diocesan boundaries should be redrawn to better fit demographic reality. Some of these older places in Italy and places like that, what used to be a very important city is no longer an important city, and so maybe that should just be a village in a larger diocese, and so there was some talk about doing that. Not long after this, Dearden helped there used to be 5 dioceses in Michigan, and he met with the other bishops, and they created 2 new dioceses. So they created Gaylord and Kalamazoo. Obviously, originally there was only one, that was Detroit. first it was Cincinnati, we were all part of Cincinnati. And then Detroit became the diocese of the whole state of Michigan. And then Lansing and Grand Rapids and Saginaw gradually chipped off. And then in the early 1970s, they added Kalamazoo. And then that meant they had to shift the boundaries. So Washtenaw County, which used to be part of Detroit, was shifted over to Lansing because there had to be some rearrangement of boundaries. So they're actually calling for that here, that a diocese should not be so large and unmanageable that people have no way of knowing each other. They should be relatively manageable. And in Italy, there are dioceses that are no bigger than some of our suburban parishes. One city and a few little tiny villages, maybe a total population of 8 or 10,000 people is a diocese in Italy. That is common, but in the United States we have larger districts. Episcopal conferences and diocesan regions should be consulted to meet these needs. Notice they're making this reference to Episcopal conferences. In other words, there's the diocese, and then there's the metropolitan, the archdiocese, the archbishop, that's Detroit in this case, and that's called a province, so the province of Michigan. So there are 7 bishops in Michigan, 7 ordinaries, and they meet together as a province. Now, they're each independent. Each of them is an independent diocese, but they meet together occasionally to kind of settle some things and make sure there's some consistency. So, for example, there's a policy that when a young couple wants to get married, they have to contact their parish priest 6 months before the proposed date. They need to have some time to make sure that there's some catechesis done. Maybe there's some difficulty with one of them has a previous marriage or something like that. You need to talk about those things. So they have to give 6 months. And you can't just come into the office and say to the priest, I'd like to get married next month. You've got to give that time for the preparation for the marriage. Well, that's a decision that was made by all 7 bishops in unison in Michigan. And they decided, let's do this together. That way we'll publish this, and that everybody knows, no matter what parish you belong to, you got to go to the priest at least 6 months before you get married to get the process going. So that was a provincial decision. In administrative and financial things in the Diocese of Michigan, we have what we call the Michigan Catholic Conference. And so all of our insurance policies and whatnot are all cared for. It's a self-insured program by the 7 dioceses. They do it together. So that's what a province is. Now there's also a region. And so Michigan and Ohio compose a region. I don't know how much they do together. Probably, I don't know what they do together. There doesn't seem to be much sense for that. But there may be some things that they do as a region. And out west, there would be several states that make up a region. But then there's the Episcopal Conference, the bishops' conferences. That's a national conference. Every nation has a conference of bishops. So in our case, the United States, all the bishops in the United States meet together a couple times a year. They always have a formal meeting every November, and they usually meet in the springtime, but it's sometimes a more prayerful or conversational time. It isn't always a business meeting. In the fall, it's almost always a business meeting. And so they meet annually. Incidentally, only the ordinaries, only the actual bishop of the diocese has decisive voting power. The other bishops, the auxiliary bishops, attend those meetings and they can speak, but they can't vote on various issues. They sometimes are allowed to vote on things, but basically the ordinary each diocese. Technically, there is only one bishop in a diocese. There is the exception made near the end that for the good of the faithful, because the good of the faithful is preeminent, the faithful's needs are preeminent, you may have auxiliary bishops, if the faithful really need it. Now, basically, what they're thinking of is confirmations. Since normally the bishop does confirmations, they have 2 or 3 auxiliary bishops in places like Detroit to help with that. But really, there oughtn't to be other bishops. The theology of it is there's one bishop in the district, and he has presbyters to do the council and work with him. So there's really no need for a bunch of auxiliary bishops. But that custom has continued to the present day. Whether or not that will ever change, theologians are calling for that, but it doesn't. We'll see if that ever changes. Now, it's fun to have auxiliary bishops sometimes. They can be a presence. The other day we had a vocations day, and so Fiorentina came to it, and she knew Bishop Hanchin when he was still a seminarian, so she says, why don't you come and bring your banjo? And so he does. And so we have this meeting with the junior high kids talking about religious vocation. And Hanchin was there, and he knows a little Spanish, so he was able to say a few words in Spanish. We don't have many Spanish kids in our class, in our school, but we had a couple families that perked up their ears when they heard him talking Spanish. And he played his banjo. And so it's kind of, sometimes it's useful to have a bishop on hand, but pretty much it's window dressing. It really isn't a theological reality.
He's a pastoral.
Yeah, and he has a region, so he's in the region of Detroit, the whole city of Detroit, so that's useful for us because he has an affinity for the city. Number 28, all presbyters, diocesan, and religious share with the bishop in the exercise of the one priesthood of Christ, and therefore are cooperators in the episcopal order. Now, in our region, that would be the priests at St. Scholastica, the Companions of Christ, of the Cross, and Jesuits at Peter Claver and Jesu. Those are religious priests. Okay? And Passionist priests in the retreat house there on the expressway. So you have a variety of priests who are not diocesan priests. People will ask me, what order are you? Well, I'm not a religious order as such. I'm a diocesan priest. That means my service is directly to the Church of Detroit. And so I will always be assigned to some parish in Detroit, the Detroit diocese. A religious order priest has a different structure of administration, so they may be sent to Chicago or Kansas or wherever that particular district is. So they have a different authority structure and a different community identity. But as long as they're working in a given diocese, they join in with the ministry of the bishop of that diocese. Now, they're making a point of this because there are some places where sometimes these religious order priests pretty much were pretty independent, and for good or for bad, but they were independent. And so they're trying to say that there needs to be more of a collaboration. So religious order priests come to all the priest meetings. So we have meetings of all the priests of the city, for example. The Companions of the Cross come to that meeting. The Jesuits come to that meeting. So that way we can affiliate with one another. We know each other to some extent. And we work together under the one Episcopal ministry of the bishop. Notice number 30 in the middle, the celebration of the Eucharist is the heart and soul of the parish community life. Parish priests are called to know their people, visit them personally, tend to the young, the poor, the sick. They should give special support to working people. They encourage the faithful to be engaged in the lay apostolate. So now that's a specific reference to how the presbyters carry on the bishop's ministry in a given locality. Then bishops should assign their priests not only by their knowledge of faith, but also their piety, apostolic zeal, and other pastoral gifts. And you see that in this interview with John Allen in Buenos Aires, that Francis, when he was bishop there,